Monday, October 14th, 2024, and you're listening to Saints, Sinners, and Salvageables, a Hoover Institution podcast examining America's democratic process and the many challenges inherent in staging elections in these charged partisan times. I'm Bill Whalen. I'm the Hoover Institution's Virginia Hobbs Carpenter Distinguished Policy Fellow in Journalism. And before I go any further, let me explain what we're up to today and what we'll be offering in the weeks ahead. 2 years ago, we introduced Saints, Sinners, and Salvageables as a companion to our Matters of Policy and Politics podcast. We did so because we're interested in America's elections, but also because here at the Hoover Institution, we have one of the nation's foremost authorities on elections and election law. That would be my colleague, Ben Ginsberg, the Hoover Institution's Volker Distinguished Visiting Fellow and a nationally known political law advocate who's now involved in several projects involving election integrity. One example of Ben's work, he recently helped organize a symposium at the Ford Presidential Library. It was called Ballots and Battlegrounds. It featured elected officials from a handful of battleground states discussing safeguards in place. Ben, thanks for coming back on the podcast and for bringing back another round of Saints, Sinners, and Salvageables. Boy, the election's only 3 weeks away, Ben, but my gosh, it seems like 2022 was just yesterday.
Yes, it certainly does, Bill. Thanks for having me back, and I'm looking forward to this.
Good. So today we're going to kick off the series by doing just sort of an overview of things, Ben. And let's begin with this, the title of this podcast, Saints, Sinners, and Salvageables. Who are the saints, who are the sinners, Ben, and who are the salvageables when we're talking about American elections?
Well, it's interesting, Bill. It sort of depends on which side of the physical divide you're standing on who are the saints, who are the sinners. I think everybody agrees on the salvageables. So the saints are either the people who are working with election officials and upholding the democratic process, or the saints see themselves as those who have been calling the election system flawed, rigged, and fraudulent and demanding a fix to save American democracy. The sinners are, of course, the opponents of either, and the salvageables are those on either side who might listen to some logical persuasion.
And who has the upper hand these days, Ben?
You know, I think that the weight of governmental authority is certainly and facts, is on the side of the people who uphold and say our elections are reliable. After all, in all the clutter and all the noise, and all the court cases brought after the 2020 election, there has been no evidence of fraud that would have overturned any election results. So I think the upper hand is with people who have facts and evidence on their side.
Okay, that is good to hear. So, Ben, I study the weather religiously because I have family in the Southeast. They are very prone to getting sucked by hurricanes. Indeed, one family in Greenville, South Carolina, got whacked by it. Normally, it's the family in Charleston, South Carolina that gets hit. So I want to make an analogy here, and in no way do I want to seem insensitive to the plight of people who've been suffering through these terrible storms lately. But, Ben, when we talk about American elections, it strikes me that we're kind of talking something similar to a very terrible storm that's fast approaching Florida. It's a big, menacing looking blob that is slowly moving in our direction. It's a question, Ben, of exactly where it's going to make landfall. Like a storm, Ben, it's a question of how quickly the storm is going to move through and how much damage it's going to construct. Do you like that analogy, or do you think I'm off base here?
Well, I don't think you're off base. I think we have been hearing a lot for a long time that challenges, again, without evidence, the basic fundamental institution of American elections. That institution is key to what we do as a country in terms of the peaceful transfer of power. It's key to the consent of the governed. No matter who wins the election, you need people to believe that the results are accurate. And there is so much noise about the issue that it is a gathering storm, and it all very much seems to be focused on November 5th in a handful of states. Unprecedented amounts of litigation, which is certainly gathering clouds, thundering, ominous rhetoric, which I suppose we could say is the thunder.
Yes.
And the sheets of rain are, I think, all the people who do seem to be very hyped up about this issue.
Okay, good. So I'm not off base on that. You know, one challenge I find here, Ben, with how America does elections is we live in this very cynical age where people are just prone to conspiracies. They're prone to looking at something and quickly thinking it's fake, it's artificial, you name it. We just pick apart everything in society this way. And elections, Ben, are prone to this same problem in this regard. It's a visual problem for people. You watch the turns on election night. In 2020, this was the case, and there's Donald Trump ahead on election night, the so-called red mirage, as you see it. But then what comes after the election and the days afterwards is what's called the blue shift. In other words, a Republican candidate does well on election night, but then when the absentee votes, when the mail-in votes get pounded, it counted shifts to the Democrats, Ben, and this makes some people leery. And I don't know how you change this, given the way we do elections, if in 2024, once again, we're going to see the red mirage, the blue shift. And actually, that's one of the questions here, Ben. Are we going to see that same red to blue shift?
Well, I think we're certainly going to see that a shift. So some states count election day votes first. They tend to be Republican. Other states actually do count their mail votes first because they're allowed to pre-process them, and then they just go into the regular election night counts. So the red wave and the blue mirage is a real thing, but it depends on states. And one thing that I think people need to be aware of is you're not going to know who won this race on election night. In fact, policymakers in 5 of the 7 battleground states have put in laws or policies that are going to actually slow down the count from 4 years ago. And they're doing that in the name of their version of wanting to get it right instead of wanting to get it fast. And that's probably a good policy, except for the turmoil that we all remember from 2020 in that period between the close of polls and the following Saturday when it wasn't clear who won the election.
Yeah, one challenge, Ben, is that if you look at the two parties right now, Democratic voters and Republican voters have very different attitudes when it comes to how they plan to vote. I'm not talking about the percentage who plan to vote, but how Democrats and Republicans vote. The Pew Research Center, Ben, has been doing some interesting numbers on this. They found that 54% of Trump voters say they will only vote in person. Only 20% will do it by mail ballot. Conversely, the Harris voters, only 35% say they will vote in person. 42% say they would rather do a mail ballot.
Yeah, there is a real difference in sort of attitudes among the country. It is interesting what the Republican Party is going through. In the many years I worked for the Republican National Committee and candidates running, we always had very active mail balloting programs and took great advantage of it. We are, after all, the older of the two political parties, and so the convenience of the voters through mail was an attribute we put into play with great success. That obviously has been different with Donald Trump as the president, so that now Republicans do not like to vote by mail as much as Democrats and do want to vote in person. But that is a flawed political strategy, as you can see today from the mixed messages coming out of the Republican Party and its nominee. The Republican National Committee has a very active program, really championed by Laura Trump, to get people to vote early, because that is a much sounder practice for wily political operatives on the ground to have the votes banked before Election Day. Yet there is that fear articulated by Donald Trump about the accuracy of mail voting. So you've got a little bit of a mixed message coming through the Republican Party that's reflected in those statistics from Pew you just mentioned.
So the mixed message would be that the daughter, Laura Trump, the head of the RNC, is saying vote early to make sure your vote gets counted. But her father, the nominee, has been saying don't vote early because we don't trust your vote getting counted, right?
Well, some of the time. I mean, honestly, Donald Trump has urged people to vote early. Donald Trump has urged people to vote early on some occasions, but then on others, not so much. And even in a number of his rally speeches, where he is criticizing the practice of mail voting, there is signage right above him that says vote early. So there is a bit of a mixed message problem.
Yeah, one other thing that Pew has found, Ben, is there's been a marked decline in requests for mail ballots. Pew says these requests are down 58% from 2020. They've also found that fewer voters are using mail ballots in 2024. Right now, they're estimating 31% versus 46% back in 2020. Now, I can easily say, well, we're not on the heels of a pandemic right now as we were in 2020, so maybe more people are willing to vote in person, but would you read anything more into that, Ben? Does it get into questions of enthusiasm? Does this get into questions of the voters' fondness for the two candidates?
I think it's more a process question.
Mhm.
I think more people would prefer to vote in person. I think in 2020 it was really challenging to do that with COVID. I think that there will probably be more mail voting in 2024 than there was in 2016,
Mhm.
but far less in 2020. And especially because it's not started in every state yet. I would be a little bit cautious about reading too much into those numbers.
Yeah, I was just looking at a map before we came on the air, Ben, and I was just shocked by how many different states have different times when they trigger the vote. Pennsylvania's been doing this, gosh, going back to what, mid-September, I believe. I think Nevada is doing it starting in the next couple days. So there's no uniform
There's
standard here.
no. We believe in a fierce federalism where each state and indeed each locality gets to make up a lot of its rules.
Okay, Ben, let's talk about those states. So a 50-state election, but I agree that it's basically a 7-state election. Those are 2 states in the
Yes.
South, North Carolina and Georgia. 2 in the West, Arizona and Nevada, the New West, I guess the near West is what I like to call it. And then 3 in, I don't want to say Rust Belt, that's insulting, but Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania. So that's 7 states in all, Ben. Let's talk about what these states have and have not done since 2020 and 2022. And here I'm going to turn to our friend Clint Eastwood and let's talk about the good, the bad, and the ugly. So, Ben, I've assigned these states to various categories here, and I want you to push back where you think that I am mistaken. In the category of good, Ben, I have Georgia, Nevada, and Michigan because they moved up their voting timelines. But I think you don't entirely agree with that assessment.
I don't. I certainly do agree about Michigan that has done a lot to move up its timeline uh, in that. Nevada still has a rule that allows mail ballots, those marked on election day,
Mhm.
to be returned up to 4 days after the election. It's the only one of the 7 battleground states that do that. And so that can, if it's tight in Nevada, you're going to wait a long time for that to actually know what happened. Georgia has done a lot to improve its timeliness. Remember, this was a state that managed to hand recount 5 million ballots in 2020 by November 19th. So the Georgia election system is very efficient. There is currently a state election board that is passing rules that, if they're not struck down by the courts, stand to slow down that process a lot. They're calling for a reconciliation, a
Mhm.
count of the actual number of ballots cast with what
Mhm.
goes through the machines, which will slow down the results. They've also passed a rule, and this sort of supersedes state law, so I'm not sure it's going to hold up, that says that local election officials, if they believe that there is a problem with fraud, can go about looking at specific precincts' election results before they certify. And so that can slow down the process. So Georgia, structurally, I would agree with you on, but there are some developments that would throw it into question potentially.
Okay, a conspiratorial mind might ask, who are these election officials? Who are these people?
Well, Donald Trump shouted out the 3 that now make up the new majority of the Georgia State Election Board at a rally he held a couple of months ago in the state, and so they are Trump supporters.
Mhm. Okay, so no funny business among the election officials, you think? Okay, so the good, we had Georgia, Nevada, Michigan, but you pushed back on that. The bad, Ben, I chose Wisconsin for this reason. They looked at processing absentee ballots before election day. The legislature wouldn't play ball.
Well, 2 states did that, Wisconsin and Pennsylvania.
Mhm.
Pennsylvania also is not allowing the pre-processing of ballots
Right.
before election day. That will slow things down. Historically, Wisconsin does a pretty good job of getting its results in early. They were about 4 or 5 p.m. On the Wednesday after the 2020 election. But one thing that slows it down that they didn't fix was a central count system in I believe the 39 cities of Wisconsin. That's especially true in Wisconsin, in Milwaukee. If they counted those ballots in the precinct, it would get done much quicker than in a central count. But Wisconsin is still a pretty sound system. Pennsylvania, as you mentioned, does not process things quickly. They have 67 counties with a great deal of autonomy. They can't process till election day. It took them till Saturday last time. So again, if it's close margins and a lot of mail voting, it's going to take a while for Pennsylvania to get done.
Yeah, and Ben, finally, in the category of ugly, I had Pennsylvania and Arizona because they had very complicated vote counts last time. I'm not sure what they've done differently to change that.
Well, Pennsylvania, we just talked about. Arizona did not change a law that allows mail ballots to be dropped off in the polling place up to 7 p.m. on election day. And Donald Trump said, don't trust your ballots to the mail. So Maricopa County, home to 60% of the state's voters, got 500,000 ballots walked in on election day. So that took a real long time to process. Another factor that's going to make Arizona potentially ugly is that there are so many races and referendum on the state ballot that Maricopa County has had to go to a 2-page ballot for the first time in history. So that doubles the number of pieces of paper that will have to be processed in Maricopa County before they can announce results. So I think we can agree that's kind of ugly.
Mm-hmm. Ben, what happened to the We the People Act? Once upon a time, there was this idea to fix elections. It was called the We the People Act. The idea was to create uniform standards for federal elections. What happened? What happened to this noble crusade?
Well, it was For the People Act, and really it should be subnamed the For the Democratic People Act. It was a sort of a Christmas tree bill for groups on the left who wanted all sorts of fixes. Would have added things like 2 Senate seats in places that would have voted Democratic. It was the Democrats' wish list on campaign finance and redistricting. Did all sorts of things to the courts. Basically, it was a monster that died of its own weight. Part of the provisions were an attempt to federalize elections. One of the things that I think absolutely holds true for elections is that one size does not fit all. That, in point of fact, the way people vote in an urban area is not the same as the way they vote in a rural area. I think the people who drafted that act forgot to talk to election officials, because I do a lot of work with election officials, and they uniformly opposed that act because the numbers that they had in there for the number of days of this or that just bore no semblance to the reality of real jurisdictions. So that was a Washington test tube baby that, frankly, never got into the real world.
Yeah, I think one problem here, as you mentioned, there was really no local input. It seems to be, Ben, that if you're going to do real election reform, it's got to be driven from the bottom up, not the top down. But secondly, Ben, the act didn't get into state elections, did it?
It didn't get into state elections because it really couldn't. So it also would have set up, I think, a bifurcated election system where states would have gone their own way on any number of provisions that were called for in that act.
Okay.
You know, Bill, you're going to be surprised to know that that act is an example of Washington, D.C. not knowing everything.
I'm shocked. I'm shocked. And you say that sitting right now in Washington, D.C. as you are. All right, Ben, I know you are. So you never call a Marine a former Marine. Do we ever call a lawyer a former lawyer?
Probably not. Not this time of year, anyway.
How about a recovering lawyer?
Yeah, I don't believe you ever recover from it, though.
All right, get out your law degree, Ben, and get out your little diploma, and let's talk about some litigation here, Ben. My understanding is that Republicans right now have filed something like 120 lawsuits across 20 states in America, preparing election challenges. We don't hear much about what the Democrats are up to, though.
Well, the Democrats have filed their own large number of cases, maybe not that large, but they've certainly not been shy about litigating. And the Democrats are intervening, if they're not already parties, in virtually all the cases that the Republicans have filed. So I do believe that the Democrats are, in addition to actively litigating, preparing a ground operation to deal with legal issues that would arise on election day, because both parties do that every election.
And Ben, when we're talking about lawsuits, could you explain a bit how the legal energy is challenged and hardest? The Republican National Committee, I assume, has lawyers. The Trump campaign has lawyers. The state parties have lawyers. The individual candidates, lawyers. How do the lawyers sort out?
Well, there are really two buckets of lawyers, I would say. There are the lawyers who are representing the national party committees. About 10 years ago, Congress approved a legal proceedings fund in which individuals could give up to something like $120,000 a year. And so the political parties have, as is their wont, raised a boatload of money that can be used on legal proceedings. Nature abhors a vacuum, and so there is a lot of litigation coming out of both political parties. In addition, the very robust 501c3 charitable organization side of things has recognized that filing lawsuits is good for the causes they promote, as well as the fundraising that they have to do to promote those causes. And so breathless litigation is really very much a feature of our elections now, in part because the money streams are so lucrative.
Ben, I'd like to turn.
That's not entirely fair, because
Right.
both political parties, as we become a more polarized country and control of states can be in one party, there is much more legislation filed that the other party feels it needs to oppose. And so the political polarization, one party control in legislatures also contributes to this.
Ben, I'd like to get your thoughts on 4 legal challenges in 3 battleground states. And let's begin with Michigan, where you were recently. There, Republicans are suing to prevent state agencies from expanding access to voter registration, restricting the use of mobile voting sites such as vans, and imposing tighter verification rules for mail-in ballots.
Yeah, I mean, that's what I mean about the political skirmishing over rules and regulations. Democrats control the process in Michigan. They put in a suite of changes that, in the name of enfranchising more voters, would make it easier to vote. The Republicans have indicated that they think that makes it easier to cheat. In fact, it's all about mobilizing one party's voters over another, and so let the games begin.
Okay, Ben, let's now move to Nevada, where Trump allies are seeking to purge voter rolls of what they claim are ineligible voters and non-citizens.
So the non-citizen voting part and ineligible voter parts is something that states are required to sort of weed out as
Secretary
the
of State's
year
office
goes
does
through.
that, right?
Secretary of State's office in most places does that. And voter roll maintenance is a part of what happens. It is, I believe that those suits have not asked for preliminary injunctions before the election, which to me is an indication that they are kind of placeholders for the same sort of cases that Trump supporters filed after the 2020 election. In other words, make the broad allegation that the election is invalid because of ineligible voters. You got to have evidence at some point. And so by slow walking the not asking for preliminary relief before the election means you can do a little judge shopping and hope you're lucky, and then have an ongoing case in the hopper for post-election.
And how would a non-citizen actually manage to vote? Would it be as simple as just a ballot arrived at your address, wrongly sent to you, or could you show up at a voting poll and try to bluff your way through? I don't understand how exactly you could pull it off.
For non-citizen voting, you mean?
Yeah.
Or, well, for non-citizen voting, I think it's very hard to pull off. I mean, you do have to say that you are an eligible voter. In other words, a citizen of the country to vote. Where I think that non-citizen voting, there are checks that states do with other databases to try and be sure. And above all else, if a non-citizen goes in and tries to vote, that's deportable.
Right.
So for the act of casting one ballot, which is really not going to impact an election, you stand to put yourself before authorities and risk deportation, seems to be something that really is not going to happen.
Yeah, I mean, I mentioned this, Ben, because I've worked in California state government for a period, and one frustration dealing with the non-citizen part of the population is you offer state services, prenatal care, for example, and you desperately want pregnant women to come in and get prenatal care services, but because of their legal status, they are terrified of any kind of brush with government, so they want to cover healthcare. So when I hear of non-citizens lining up to vote, I'm just kind of curious why that would happen. But that does raise a question, Ben. Have any battleground states moved to voter ID laws in the past 4 years?
Yeah, I believe a couple have. I'm not sure which ones. It is an idea that's supported by over 80% of the country.
Right.
It's a pretty sensible way to give people some comfort that only eligible voters are voting. And so it tends to be something that when Republicans take control, they will always put into place pretty quickly. I think the evidence that's been presented in court that it has a disparate impact on racial minority groups, which is the Democrats' main argument, really has not proven terribly effective when push comes to shove.
It would seem a pretty straightforward argument in a society where you have to prove ID to cash a check, to prove ID, show ID to get on an airplane, to do most anything, to
Take
get,
out a library book.
get liquor at the grocery store, even though you and I obviously are well over age 21, you have to show an ID.
Yeah, speak for yourself.
Thanks, Ben. Okay, Ben, two cases in Pennsylvania now. Let's get through. First of all, Republicans are fighting to enforce strict mail-in voting rules and limit voters' ability to correct mistakes on their ballots. I believe there's a legal case. September 13th, Republicans scored a victory when the state's highest court ruled mail ballots with incorrect dates will not be counted.
Yeah, correct. It may be a Pyrrhic victory, but the victory was that you do have to date a ballot. It is what the statute says. There was a belief that that was a case that would have led to the reopening of the independent state legislature theory. And by the Pennsylvania Supreme Court, which is 5-2 Democratic, deciding not to take that case, it stopped that issue from going before the U.S. Supreme Court. So while it is not clear whether Democrats or Republicans forget to date their absentee ballots more, so that case felt like a stalking horse case to open up the independent state legislature theory.
Okay, they don't have dangling chats in Pennsylvania, do they?
Not this year.
This year. We're going to get to dangling chats in a minute. The other lawsuit, Ben, the final one we're going to get into it once again in Pennsylvania. 6 Republican congressmen filing a lawsuit claiming state violates federal election law by failing to verify the identities of service members who apply for overseas absentee ballots. The congressmen want to verify identities of people applying for overseas ballots. In Pennsylvania, Ben, ballots received before November the 5th to be segregated and not counted until the sender's identities have been verified.
Yeah, so interesting. Messing around with overseas military used to be one of those things that you don't do.
And one of the problems here, Ben, is this lawsuit comes about 2 weeks after Pennsylvania counties have started mailing
I've
ballots to
already
military and
started
overseas.
them out. And so I think the case is unlikely to go anywhere just on what's called latches, which means you got to file this stuff in a timely fashion. But it may be, again, part of something that's set up as a challenge post-election.
Okay, very good. So there you have it. Any other legal challenges you'd like to bring up while we're going through the battleground states?
No, there's so many. I hate to choose among them. It's like choosing your favorite kid.
Okay, now something I know we're going to disagree on. This is the idea that times change and campaign issues also change. I'm watching Donald Trump in the past couple of weeks, Ben, and he seems very focused on immigration. He went to Colorado to talk about immigration. He went to Coachella in the middle of nowhere in California to talk about immigration. To me, this is smart politics, even though Colorado and California are not in play, because every day when immigration is in the news cycle, that's a good day for Trump. But My argument is that he's talking more about immigration and he's talking less about stop the steal, but you counter that no, he's still talking about stop the steal.
He's still talking about stop the steal. I mean, when your rally speeches go for 90 minutes, you can hit a lot of topics. And, you know, the stop the steal whispering is still very much a part of the process and very much a part of the campaign logic. So, I mean, I think that you're right in that immigration is a much more politically charged issue that he thinks probably rightly can get him more votes.
Yeah.
But the election integrity part of his argument is still there in every rally speech and certainly in all the activities of the Republican National Committee.
Right. But that said, Ben, we have not seen him go to Maricopa County and hold an election rally, if you will, an election integrity rally where he's with Kerry Lake, who's running in the Senate there, and they're waving the flag of, stop the steal and so forth. He hasn't gone to that point now. Again, 3 weeks before the election, maybe he does a rally at some point, but it seems to me he's at the moment focused in other directions.
Yeah, it may be. And it's interesting. It may be part of a broader political strategy to just kind of keep them in safe spaces like big rallies and not to talk about that issue as much with Senate candidates who are significantly behind their Democratic opponents.
Right. Well, you can appreciate this, Ben, as an attorney, because we're now in the closing arguments phase of essentially a very long trial for the American people. Donald Trump and Kamala Harris running for office. But I look at her side right now, Ben, and she seems to be a little off in terms of messaging right now. She is going after Trump on healthcare records, on his personal medical records. Barack Obama is complaining about black men not voting for her in sufficient numbers. I don't hear her talking a lot about democracy dying in darkness.
Democracy is an issue that they're talking about. She may not be talking about it exclusively, but she's still talking about it. And certainly their messaging, at least their micro-targeting messaging, is not forgetting the democracy issue. But look, these are two campaigns that are not moving forward with specific policy debates, right? They're putting out press releases that say, here's how I'm going to fix the economy. But then you read through it and you know it's a lot of stuff that's getting thrown out that no Congress, even if one dominated by one party, would pass. They're each in their own little bubbles and trying to appeal to, I guess, who their pollsters are telling them are the few persuadable voters out there.
Right. I watch a lot of college football on Saturdays, Ben, and so I get, unfortunately, a lot of presidential ads thrown in there. And his ads against her, the main ads I see against her have been run by a Trump PAC, which goes after her on her policy as Attorney General of allowing trans prisoners in California to have gender switching surgery. So he's going after a real kind of meat potato cultural issue there. Her ads against him, Ben, have been directed about billionaires and tax cuts and wealth. So again, I'm not seeing him complaining about stolen elections and ads, but I'm also not seeing her showing footage of January the 6th.
Yeah, I think that is a fair point. But if you look at all the polling, it's pretty clear that the issues that voters are most animated about is the economy and how you're going to fix it, and immigration. And so I think it is not unlikely that elections, I think, strike most people as a process issue as opposed to a pocketbook issue. And so it's not surprising to me in the final moments that they are talking about those issues.
So our listeners should know that Ben does a lot of work at Hoover on election integrity. Ben is involved in projects beyond Hoover on election integrity. Ben writes about elections, but you recently were on 60 Minutes.
I was quite a moment.
I remember, what's the old joke? You it's been a bad day when you lose your job, your wife divorces you, and you come home and Mike Wallace is on the doorstep waiting for you.
I got to go to them, so that was good.
That was. So I mentioned 60 Minutes because this was an episode they did on the same night they ran the Kamala Harris interview, and it's centered around Maricopa County and specifically what the fortunes of your friend Stephen Richer, who is the Maricopa County recorder, who just had one of the worst jobs in American politics, if not the worst in 2020, his job to count the votes in Maricopa.
Yeah, I mean, Stephen ran the election. He did not, he was not the guy in charge of the 2020 election. He was elected himself to that job in 2020.
And he's a Republican. He's also a Republican.
He is a Republican. lost in the Republican primary in 2024
Mhm.
because he did know how elections are run and was very forthright in trying to explain to people that, in fact, elections are accurate, including the 2022 gubernatorial race, which Kerry Lake lost.
Mhm. All right. So you talked about on 60 Minutes, you talked about Maricopa and the election. Stephen said something rather interesting in the course of his interview that caught my attention, made me think about you, Ben. He said, and I quote, "I would say Maricopa County's 2020 election is the most scrutinized election in human history." And what immediately flashed to my brain, Ben, was that image of that guy in Palm Beach County, I think it was, holding up a magnifying glass to a ballot to figure out, is this a dangling Chad or not?
Well, Stephen's young.
Yes.
So
He wasn't around in 2000.
right. He was but a lad.
But,
Look,
but you were around for the legal challenge. Let's actually back up for a second. Let's talk a little bit about what happened in Florida that year with Palm Beach County, with the ballot, the Chad, and how that compares contrast to Maricopa's experience.
the experience in Florida in 2000 was over a 537 vote margin election. So
Right.
that is legitimately close and one subject to a recount.
Right.
So that you had Democrats and Republicans all looking at the same ballots
Mhm.
and recognizing there was a lot of skirmishing over what the rules were. In other words, what the law called for and how you dealt with chads.
Right.
That's very different from the way Maricopa was,
To
where
explain, I'm sorry, to explain better, Chad is a puncture that you make.
so there was an old kind of ballot called punch card ballots in which the voter was instructed to punch these little perforated rectangles, really called chads, all the way through the ballot. Because it was something of an antiquated system, a voter could attempt to punch through a chad and not always get all the way through.
Yes.
Although state law was pretty clear, you had to knock the little piece of paper out from the ballot.
And that's what the guy with the magnifying glass was doing. He was looking at the ballot for intent of penetration.
Well, there were these things, intent to penetrate is right. There's such a thing as pregnant chads in that recount, where you would see little perforations or a slight extension of the squares, and so
Right.
people were trying to divine the intent of the voters on that basis.
Right. But Florida ends up being decided by the Supreme Court.
It ends up being decided by the Supreme Court. The ballots themselves were the subjects afterwards of media recounts to see if it was done right. Virtually all of them upheld the very narrow George W. Bush victory. Maricopa County in 2020 was not nearly so close, 11,000 vote margin in Arizona. People really don't make up 11,000 votes in a recount. That's never happened. The rules of the game were not over individual ballot markings. It was over illegal votes being cast, which is pretty different. Remember also, and why I think Stephen Richer said it was the most scrutinized election in at least his modern memory, was that there was the audit conducted by the Arizona State Senate, hiring a firm called the Cyber Ninjas, in which they took several months to look at every ballot and try and show that there was something wrong with the result. And in fact, Joe Biden's margin only increased in their erstwhile audit.
Okay. Let's now talk, Ben, about how legal challenges will factor into this election in this regard. First of all, what do you expect, Ben, in the way of legal challenges to state tallies, state certification?
I think much of this depends on the margins. There is conversations about local jurisdictions refusing to certify the results. And there are instances where that's happened. Arizona had a few, Georgia had a few. There are clear laws in every state that certification is a ministerial act. You got to do it if you're a government official. It's not discretionary. And the courts, in fact, have never allowed non-certification to take place. A couple of people in Arizona are facing criminal charges now. So I think it is unlikely that any certification challenges will work. Now, interestingly enough, if you refuse to certify a jurisdiction on the grounds that you think there's fraud, that affects every race on the ballot, not just the presidential race.
Right.
So that if this lack of certification comes in Republican counties, in effect, you're going to have Republican members of Congress, Republican members of state legislature, your local officials also not certified. So I think that it is something that may take place by a few misguided souls, but is unlikely to work.
Yeah, you mentioned, Ben, this would also be a function just on the math, the results, but is there a statistic would you say this, if it's like a 1% difference, a 0.5% difference, a 1/10 of 1% difference, what number do you think would trigger the challenge?
Well, it's not the job of those officials who certified to make that call.
Right.
Their job is to take the results, be sure the math is right, and sign off on it. Once they sign off on it, then that can trigger a recount or a contest or litigation where you can actually see if there is any evidence to suggest the election was done wrong. So I think the certification is maybe an attempt in a state, local level, to affect a state that's narrow. But, what people who think they can get away with not certifying will consider the trigger for that, I don't know.
Which basket of lawyers, Ben, would fight the certification? Would it be the state parties? Would it be the candidates?
Could be any of them. Depends a little bit by state who might have grounds to do that. I think that, especially based on the conference we held with the Battleground election officials, that every state, whether it's a Republican or a Democratic Secretary of State, will insist that the locality certify the results and begin the process where you can recount or contest an election.
Okay, Ben. Second kind of challenge. What if one state, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, Georgia, Arizona, Nevada, whatever battleground state you want to choose, what if they end up in a court pipeline? The likelihood you think one of them might end up in the same court pipeline that Florida did. And maybe you can explain exactly how Florida ended up at the Supreme Court and how that would play out in 2024, how a state would go down the same road.
Well, in 2000, it ended up at the Supreme Court over fights about whether deadlines in the state statute had to be observed or not.
But it was adjudicated first through the state Supreme Court, right?
Well, twice, yes.
Twice, yeah.
And the state Supreme Court decided to ignore a U.S. Supreme Court ruling on its first. Not a good policy if you want the U.S. Supreme Court on your side. So it is likely to be over timelines. There are strict timelines about when states need to take the action for the Electoral College. So December 11th is a date where a state has to have its certificate of ascertainment. That indicates who meets on December 17th in each state capital, the electors, to cast their ballots. And then those ballots have to be in Washington before January 3rd and the start of Congress.
Okay. And thirdly, Ben, let's talk about legal possibilities come the time things shift to Washington and the Electoral College meets to actually, Congress meets to actually certify the election. One scenario that comes to mind here, it's Donald Trump winning the election with a scant amount of electoral votes, barely enough to get over the top. Let's say 273 electoral votes, Ben. Then 4 people decide that they don't want to vote for Donald Trump. These are called faithless electors. Trump is now down to 269 in the Electoral College, or even lower. He doesn't get the 270. The faithless, let's say, switch over to Kamala Harris. She becomes president. How legally does this play out, Ben? First of all, what would Trump's legal challenges, what would his options be at that point?
Well, you will know on December 17th if there are any faithless electors. So
Okay.
that's 2 weeks before people get to Washington.
Right.
There are a number of states, I think about 2/3 of the states, have laws in place to stop faithless electors from being faithless. So it depends on which state this mystical faithless elector lives in. It's also worth noting that the process for selecting the electors is up to the Democratic and Republican state parties. They put the names on the ballot.
Right.
So, they are usually pretty faithful people, I think, especially this time, with the way the local state parties are operating.
Yeah.
I suppose you also have the possibility of members of Congress trying to attack the constitutional provenance of those fake electors, so that they might be excluded or their votes not allowed to be changed.
And this happened in 2004.
Yeah, or then at least the attempt.
Yes. And what senator pushed this forward?
I believe that was a California senator, if I'm not mistaken, named Barbara Boxer.
Would be the lady who held the Senate job that Kamala Harris took over. So yes,
Yes,
Barbara
indeed.
Boxer. She led that, but the idea was that Ohio's results were bogus, and so they wanted to
Yeah.
challenge the outcome in Ohio.
Yes.
So it's been done. And there were faithless electors in 2016, but geez, I think the count going to that, Ben, was like 306 Trump and 232 Hillary. So yeah, a few people could walk either way and it doesn't matter. But the idea of somebody walking, though, when they could shift the outcome of the election, holy smokes.
Well, again, you'll know December 17th when they meet in the state capitals. So that does leave time for litigation.
Yeah. I think if anybody tried that scenario, my goodness, I would hate to think what would happen to him. I think they'd probably have to remember Steve Bartman, the guy who caught the baseball at the Cubs game and he cost them the World Series.
Right.
This would be Bartman to a whole different degree. But so this is the first of the series we're doing on elections, state senators and salvageables. Ben, we're going to do 3 more episodes, and coming up next, you're going to take over the moderating duties for me. I'm just going to lurk and listen to you weave your magic. You're going to interview your colleague Justin Grimmer.
I am. I hope I've learned at the foot of the master here for this, Bill.
Why is Justin the master?
Justin, well, no, you're the master of the podcast. Justin is doing extremely interesting work about elections and the impact of legislation on actual votes. Right. He also made a recent trip up to Coos Bay, Oregon, at the invitation of the county supervisors to engage what I found to be an incredibly lively and illuminating debate with one of Donald Trump's strongest advocates on election denial. And so we'll be talking about some of the arguments that were raised in that setting and how valid they were.
I was going to ask you what camp he went into, because Oregon, even though it tends to vote Democratic overall, it's a tricky state politically, Ben. You can go to Beaverton or Portland and be in the greenest, crunchiest parts of America. You can also go to Southern Oregon, Ben, where people have been for decades now agitating to form a different state called Jefferson because they're sick of Oregon politics.
Well, this county is a pretty red county.
Yeah.
But not exclusively.
Okay. You're going to talk about Hoover's Restoring Confidence in American Elections program, I suspect.
Yes, we will indeed. Justin and I are both part of the RAI and Preserving American Institutions. And we will talk about all the work that's being done there, including some papers we each authored and co-authored for the Tannenbaum series about American elections and some of the myths that are perhaps malforming our elections today.
Okay, and just for the record, Justin Grimmer is a Stanford political scientist and a Hoover Fellow, so yes, well versed in these topics. After that, Ben, it's going to be you and I back on the microphone, and I'm looking forward to this just from a curiosity standpoint, because we're going to do a podcast early on the morning of the 7th of November. I'm just curious to what kind of physical shape you're going to be in, because you're probably going to pull an all-nighter on the 5th.
Yeah, I'm young and strong, fortunately. And you're going to be a little tired yourself. It's pretty early in the morning for you.
I have three things going on that morning. You and I are going to record that podcast, and then you and I, that I'm doing an episode of Hoover's Goodfellows after that, where we're going to talk to Brett Stevens, the New York Times columnist, on election results. And then, Ben, I think you and I are back on the microphone after that doing a briefing for Hoover donors on the election. So
We are. Well, we should have our stick down pretty well by the time the donors
I will probably
listen.
just stumble home and go to bed at that time. But you raised a point here. Come the morning of November the 7th, we may not have a winner.
No, I would, if the results are tight, they're as tight as the polls today are showing. I'm not sure we will have a winner. It really took until the Saturday after the 2020 election. Maybe as your statistics indicated, there'll be fewer mail ballots, so the processing will go quicker. But there also are those changes or lack of changes in 5 of the 7 battleground states that can slow it down.
Mm-hmm. And then we're going to do one last podcast in mid-December, Ben, about 5 weeks after the election. So surely the dust should have settled by then.
One can only hope.
One can only hope. So I don't know. What do you think we'll be looking at by mid-December? Do you think we're going to have a nice clean process and a nice clean segue into electoral votes and on to the 47th president, or is it going to be a little more chaotic?
Well, we're doing it right around the time the Electoral College is actually meeting in all the states.
Right.
So we'll know by then. I mean, again, if the race is really as close as the polls today indicate, it's likely to be a little yeasty then, still in the middle of December.
Yeasty. I like that.
Yeasty.
All right. So what does it got to tell you about this election right now? I just, we keep going through phases. We go through a phase where it looks like she's in a good spot. We go through a phase where it looks like he's in a good spot. We seem getting back to this phase though, where they just kind of run about neck and neck. I'm doing a panel in a couple of days with our colleagues David Brady and Doug Rivers, who run a tracking poll, Ben, on the public's like 100,000 people who they're constantly keeping a track on. They show a razor thin election. Plain and simple. Now, they would argue that if you look inside it, that Trump maybe has the advantage right now in battleground states, but no one's willing to make a wager at this point, and here we are 3 weeks out.
No, I don't think so. And look, I think that one of the things we'll learn about this election is whether Donald Trump has succeeded in changing the basis of the political party, right? We're reading an awful lot about how former blue-collar Democrats are migrating to the Republican Party. That means that all the historical models that pollsters use to help them weight samples and see how accurate the results are,
right,
may not be valid for this election. So I think that it's particularly challenging to know what will actually happen on November 5th.
Fascinates me in this regard, Ben. I think Gallup showed the other day for the first time, and I think in like 20 years, more people now identify as Republicans than they do Democrats. So there's something of a sea change going on.
Yep.
You would think then that the Republican candidate would pull away from the Democratic candidate, but he does not. On the other hand, the Republican candidate's about 10 points underwater. The last I looked, his disapproval about 10 points higher than his approval. You would think she could pull away under such circumstances, but she cannot.
Yeah, I think it's sort of an existential election for each party. I mean, my Republican friends are going there and going, geez, if we can't beat Kamala Harris, who can we beat? Look at her policies.
Yeah.
And my Democratic friends are going, Donald Trump, man, if we can't beat Donald Trump, who can we beat? So somebody is wrong. And the way that one of the parties is presenting itself to the American public is likely to be up for a little self-examination.
And final note, Ben, speaking of self-examination, what do you think 2025 is going to bode for you in terms of election integrity? Do you plan on convening some more sessions at Hoover? What do you have in mind?
Well, I think that got to wait and see what the results are, because that's really going to drive that process.
Yeah.
One thing that I think is true, and what I hope to do at Hoover, is take a really sort of big picture look at the system of American elections. It is kind of creaky, and it needs to be reimagined a bit. And we have over 10,000 jurisdictions. There are over 10,000 jurisdictions. You're going to have inconsistencies. You do not have a modern, the way of voting has not kept up with technological changes
Yes.
in the rest of the world. And so there are some sort of root things about the election process that I think needs to be looked at and probably reimagined and rethought.
Yeah, I think in its simplest been two things. One, it has to be better built for speed. And secondly, just better designed for trust.
Yeah, and more precise. It's not built for precision. There are too many people involved, too many jurisdictions, too many different kinds of voting equipment, and ways that voter rolls are maintained. So one size doesn't fit all, but there are some improvements that would be good.
Well, Ben Ginsberg, you are a saint for doing this podcast today. Hopefully, I was not a sinner by asking pedestrian questions. And
we think you're salvageable.
Thank you. That's what I strive for in life. What did Michael Corleone say? Just when I thought I was out, they pulled me back in. So here
There
you
you
are
go.
once again, my friend. Ben, great conversation. Thanks again for doing Saint Sinners and Salvageables. Look forward to the next show in a couple weeks.
Bill, thank you.
You've been listening to Saint Sinners and Salvageables, a Hoover Institution podcast exploring America's election system and the many challenges in the democratic process in this charged partisan environment. If you've been enjoying this podcast, please don't forget to rate, review, and subscribe to our show. And if you wouldn't mind, please spread the word. Tell your friends about us. The Hoover Institution has Facebook, Instagram, and X feeds. Our X handle is at HooverINST. That's HOOVERINST. And if you want to hear more about Ben Ginsberg, find out more about Ben. Very simple. You'll find his bio at the Hoover Institution's website, which is hoover.org. And while you're there, sign up for the Hoover Daily Report, which keeps you updated on what Ben and his colleagues are up to. That's delivered to your inbox weekdays. For the Hoover Institution, this is Bill Whalen. We'll be back soon with another installment of Saints, Sinners, and Salvageables. The next time, Ben doing the moderating. Till then, take care. Thanks for listening. And if you haven't already, don't forget to vote.